My name is Alara Vance, and the scent of wood smoke always brings me back to the moment my second life began. It was the winter of 1987, and I was squatting by the hearth in our farmhouse kitchen, feeding twisted birch logs into the hungry flames. My hands were rough and stained with ash, a world away from the soft, useless things they'd become in another time. The memory of my first death wasn't a dream, it was a scar on my soul. I had been Alara the fool. The one who poured her wages, her youth, her very soul into a man named Julian Thorne. I'd believed his promises, his whispered dreams of a future where his college education would lift us both. I worked double shifts at the textile mill, my back aching, my eyes straining in the dim light, all to fund his tuition, his books, his life in a distant city. He'd taken my savings, my dignity, and finally, with a look of cool contempt, my hope. "I'm a graduate student now, Alara," he'd said, his arm around a girl in a smart wool coat. "You're a factory girl. We inhabit different worlds." The aftermath was a blur of public shame, my mother's fury, and then her terrible final silence against the unyielding iron of his family's gate. My own end came in a rented car, the wheels screeching against gravel as I aimed us both toward the void of Raven's Crag. I'd meant it to be our shared tomb. But I woke up. I woke up to the crackle of this same fire, to the smell of stewing potatoes, and to the realization that I was 18 again. The matchmaker, old Mrs. Beecham, had just paid a visit. Her proposition hung in the air, sweet and poisonous as syrup. A meeting with young Julian Thorne, who was about to leave for State University. A brilliant match, she'd crooned. A future secured. I had refused before she'd even finished speaking. The force of my no had startled her, startled my mother, and sent the woman clucking away in confusion. I thought that was the end of it. I'd severed the thread before it could weave its trap around me again. So when our two old sheepdogs, Bear and Badger, erupted into frenzied barking that afternoon, I assumed it was the Miller kids taunting them from the lane. I dropped the firewood I was carrying and rushed out, my breath pluming in the icy air. "Hush. Leave off," I called, pushing through the rickety gate. And I froze. There he was. Not the polished, cruel man from my memories, but the raw, youthful version. Julian Thorne, at 19, stood panting at the end of our dirt path, as if he'd run the 3 miles from town. The winter wind had torn through his dark hair, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cold. He wore the ubiquitous army green coat of every young man that season, but on him, it looked like a promise of ambition. His eyes, that clear, deceptive gray, were locked on me with an intensity that once would have made my knees weak. Now it made my blood run cold. "Why?" The word burst from him, raw and demanding. "Mrs. Beecham said you refused. Why won't you even meet me?" Before I could muster the icy response forming on my tongue, my mother, Clara, appeared from the main house, a weeding hoe still in her hand. Her initial startlement melted into pure, unadulterated delight. In our small rural world, a boy like Julian, handsome, academically gifted, from a respectable family, standing on our humble doorstep was a minor miracle. It was social capital. It was a mother's dream. "Julian. Goodness, comin' out of the cold," she fussed, her earlier irritation at my refusal forgotten. She all but pulled him inside, dusting off our best chair by the fire. I watched, silent as a stone, as she performed the ritual of hospitality. She fetched the china cup saved for the pastor's visits, spooned in a precious mound of white sugar, a luxury she herself went without, and poured strong black tea over it. I stood by the doorway, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. The sweet, steamy scent of that sugared tea was an insult. My mother hadn't let me have a spoonful since my rebirth, saying it was 4 important occasions. Apparently, my future betrayal was one of them. Julian finally caught his breath. He took the cup from my mother with a politeness that was a performance. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice smoother now, a smile touching his lips. It was a good smile. A convincing one. My mother preened. "Oh, such manners. Sit. Alara, don't just stand there like a post." She began the interrogation. His family, his studies, his prospects. When he mentioned he'd been the county's top scorer on the college entrance exams, her face lit up as if he'd handed her a pot of gold. Good, she murmured, a sacred trinity of approval. "I plan to study hard," Julian said, his gaze sliding toward me, "make something of myself. I wouldn't want to disappoint anyone." The pause was deliberate, intimate. My mother saw the look. A knowing glint sparked in her eyes. Alara dear, keep our guest company. I just remembered I need a few things from the market. She gave me a broad, conspiratorial wink that made my stomach turn, grabbed her woven basket and was out the door, leaving a thick silence in her wake. The room shrank. The only sounds were the pop of the fire and the faint whistle of wind under the door. I stared at the boy who would become my ruin. I crossed the room, my movements deliberate. I held out my hand. Give it to me. He blinked, the picture of charming confusion. Give you what? I didn't answer. I simply snatched the china cup from his hand. The tea was still hot, the sugar not fully dissolved. I raised it to my lips and drank it down in one long, defiant swallow. The sweetness was cloying, a victory stolen. My mother's luxury. My due. I set the empty cup on the table with a sharp clink. Now, I said, my voice flat. Tell me why you're really here. He was taken aback, his polite mask slipping for a second. Mrs. Beecham said you refused. I wanted to know why. I saw your picture. He said the last part softly as if it were a confession. I liked it. I thought we might be a good match. A hollow laugh escaped me. The picture. Of course. In my first life, my face had been my initial currency. A good match. I repeated, letting the ridicule coat the words. Based on a photograph? You're about to be a university student, Julian. I'm a girl with dirt under her nails who tends fires. What part of that seems like a match to you? He leaned forward, his confidence returning. I have potential. I'm going to make something of myself. Isn't that what matters? What matters? I said, locking eyes with him, letting every ounce of my old bitterness and newfound clarity shine through, is that I said no. You were turned down. Yet here you are on my doorstep through sheer persistence. What did you hope to achieve? To wear me down? A flush crept up his neck. No, I thought you might be worried. About being left behind. That's it, we could have an understanding before I go. A formal arrangement. He meant a country betrothal, a feast before the paperwork, a way to chain me with tradition while he flew free. The audacity of it, the eerie echo of the past, was like a physical blow. This was how it started. The small promise, the false security. I took a deliberate step back, putting distance between us. I looked him up and down, a slow, appraising gaze that held no warmth, only assessment. Who gave you the confidence to be this presumptuous? My voice was low, deadly calm. Let me be clear, Julian Thorne. I don't like you. I'm not interested in you. If you have any self-respect at all, you will take your potential and your understanding, and you will leave. You may not feel the embarrassment of this situation, but I am feeling it quite keenly on your behalf. The words were almost verbatim what he had hissed at me in a university corridor a lifetime ago. Speaking them now, watching the color drain from his face, was the most profoundly satisfying sensation I had ever experienced. His pride, that towering fragile thing, was struck. His jaw tightened. He forced a strained smile. Alara, don't be difficult. Be realistic. Am I not the best opportunity likely to come your way? My gaze drifted past him through the small window to the yard next door. A faint, genuine smile touched my lips. Not necessarily. He followed my look, saw the modest cottage with its neat woodpile, and let out a short, derisive laugh. What, the Miller boy? Or is it the orphan? His voice dripped with contempt. The one who left school at 15? You'd compare me to unskilled labor. The arrogance was breathtaking. It was the core of him, the rot I hadn't seen until it was too late. I turned my full attention back to him, my eyes cold. He might lack your piece of paper, Julian, but you seem to lack a heart. And a brain if you think coming here after a refusal is anything but pathetic. The insult landed. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the stone floor. His composure shattered. Fine. Cling to your pride. You'll regret this, Alara. One day you'll look back and regret turning me away. Will I? I asked, tilting my head. I suppose we'll see. But I know you'll regret coming here today. He left then, his exit less a walk and more a furious retreat. The slam of the gate shook the porch. I watched him stalk down the lane, his figure growing smaller, swallowed by the gray winter landscape. A strange peace settled over me. The first thread of the old tapestry had been pulled and the pattern was already changing. I turned from the window. My eyes went again to the woodpile next door, and to the young man I could just see through the gap in the fence, methodically stacking logs with strong, capable hands. Leo Hart. In my first life after the scandal after my mother's death, when the world had become a silent, gray prison, Leo Hart had been the only one who didn't look away. He'd climbed onto that very fence the day before my doomed wedding to Julian and said, "What about me, Alara? I'm not as educated, but I've got two good hands and I don't break my promises." I'd smiled a broken smile and said, "Not in this life, Leo. But if there's another one, I'll find you." He'd grinned back, a flash of white in his sun-weathered face. "Don't be so sure. I might be the one turning you down next time." We'd had no idea how true that could be. Reincarnation, it seemed, was real. And as I watched Leo work, the solid, reliable rhythm of his movements a balm to my fractured soul, I made a new vow. This life would not be about Julian Thorne. It would not be about waiting, sacrificing, or avenging. This life would be for me. And perhaps, just perhaps, it could also be for the man who had seen my worth when I had forgotten it myself. The first step was taken. The refusal was absolute. Now I had to build something new from the ashes of the old. And it started with choosing my own path, not the one laid out by a matchmaker, a mother, or the ghost of a man who had once destroyed me. The silence after Julian's departure was richer than before, filled with the promise of averted disaster. I stood by the cold window until the last glimpse of his green coat vanished around the bend. The satisfaction was a deep, steady hum in my veins, but it was quickly chased by a practical chill. My mother would return from her fictitious market errand soon, and her delight would curdle into fury when she found her prize son-in-law prospect gone. I needed a distraction, a rock to anchor against the coming storm. My gaze, almost of its own will, returned to the yard next door. Leo Hart was repairing his fence. He moved with an economical grace, each swing of his hammer precise, each nail driven home with a solid, satisfying thwack. He was 2 years older than me, but hardship had carved a man's bearing into him early. Orphaned at 12, he'd become a fixture of our village. Not a pitted figure, but a respected one. He'd done odd jobs, then apprenticed with a carpenter, and now, at 20, he took on small construction projects and sold handcrafted furniture at the county fair. He was self-made in the truest, grittiest sense. In my first life, I'd been vaguely aware of him as a quiet, capable presence. After my fall, he'd been the only one to offer help without a whisper of judgment. The memory of his offer by the fence was a warm ember in the cold ash of that time. Now seeing him here, so vibrantly alive and unaware of the tragedies that had once entwined us, I felt a pull stronger than curiosity. It was a need for grounding, for a touch of the decency he represented. I didn't go through the gate. Instead, I dragged a 3-legged stool from our porch, placed it against the low stone wall that separated our properties, and climbed up. I rested my chin in my hands and just watched him. He worked for a good 5 minutes, lost in his task, before some animal sense made him pause. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning, and then they found me perched on the wall like a watchful bird. He froze, hammer halfway to another nail, his brow furrowing in pure, unadulterated bewilderment. "Elara Vance," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "What in the world are you doing up there?" "Watching you work," I answered simply, smiling. He blinked, the confusion deepening. A faint flush crept up his neck. He was so unpracticed. Unlike Julian's calculated charm, Leo's discomfort was genuine, endearing. He set the hammer down carefully as if it might startle me. "Well, it's not much of a show. Why aren't you, I don't know, inside? Didn't your mother have a guest?" "He left," I said, my smile turning wry. "I sent him packing." Leo's eyebrows shot up. He wiped his hands on his canvas trousers, taking a step closer to his side of the wall. "You sent Julian Thorne packing?" The college boy. A slow grin spread across his face, transforming his serious features. It was a sunrise of an expression, warm and sudden. "Bet that's a story. Did he trip over his own dictionary on the way out?" I laughed, the sound surprising me. It was light, free. Something like that. He thought his potential was a sufficient dowry. Leo shook his head, leaning against his side of the wall. We were closer now, only the rough-hewn stones between us. Full potential is just a fancy word for hasn't done anything yet. His eyes, a steady, weathered blue like the summer sky after a storm, held mine. "So what's your plan then? If not the scholar?" The question was asked with genuine interest, no presumption. It was a novel sensation. "I'm not sure," I said, and it was mostly true. The grand plan was to avoid ruin and build a life. The specifics were foggy. But I know I'm not waiting around for anyone's future to arrive. I glanced pointedly at the substantial pile of uncut logs beside our woodshed. "For now, my father's away at the seasonal work site. The firewood won't chop itself." I hadn't meant it as a request. It was more an observation, a statement of my present reality. But Leo followed my gaze, nodded once and said, "Right." Before I could ask what he meant, he was striding toward the pile. He selected 3 of the thickest oak logs, hoisted them onto his shoulder as if they were kindling, and carried them through his gate, around the front and into his own yard. "I'll bring it back split," he called over his shoulder, as if it were the most logical division of labor in the world. I was momentarily speechless. In my past life, Julian's help had always been a transaction, a debt incurred. Leo's was just action. A solution offered without fanfare. Curiosity got the better of me. I jumped off the stool, dragged it to a spot where the wall was lower, and climbed up again, peering into his yard. The scene that greeted me stole the breath from my lungs. It was a deep winter afternoon, the air sharp enough to bite. And there was Leo, having shed his flannel shirt, wearing only a pair of thick work trousers and boots. His torso was bare to the cold, muscles corded across his back and shoulders, moving with a powerful fluid rhythm as he swung a heavy splitting maul. Steam rose in faint wisps from his skin. He wasn't just chopping wood, he was conquering it. Each swing was a study in focused force, the crack of the maul biting into the grain echoing like a gunshot in the still air. One particularly massive log, as thick as my waist, resisted for a single blow before surrendering, cleaving into 2 perfect halves. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable stutter in my chest. It wasn't just the physicality of it, though that was arresting enough. It was the sheer, unadorned competence. The visible proof of a man who met the world head-on and demanded it yield. "Leo," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. The maul's descent halted mid-arc. He spun around, his eyes widening in sheer shock at finding me on the wall again. He fumbled, the maul slipping from his grip to thud on the frozen ground. Flustered, he scrambled for his discarded shirt, yanking it over his head, his movements uncharacteristically clumsy. "For pity's sake, Elara," he sputtered, his face flushing a deep, glorious red that reached the tips of his ears. "What's with you and walls today? Have you no shame? A girl shouldn't be spying like that." His embarrassment was so acute, so pure, that my own sudden shyness mirrored it. I'd been the one ogling, and here he was, acting as if he'd committed the indiscretion. I looked away, focusing on a knot in the wood of the fence. "I wasn't spying," I mumbled, my own cheeks warm. "I was checking on my firewood. I'll get down." "Wait." His voice was softer now. He approached the wall, looking up at me. His gaze was no longer angry, but searching, lingering on my face with an intensity that was different from Julian's hungry appraisal. This felt like a cataloging, a quiet study. "So," he said, his voice casual but his eyes serious. "How did the great matchmaking debacle end?" "Really?" I grinned, my composure returning. "I told you. I refused him. Flat out." He whistled low, leaning his arms on the wall, now just a foot below me. "Seriously, he's going to be a university man. That's the golden ticket out of here for most. You're not tempted?" "He's golden ticket for himself," I corrected. "Not for anyone holding his coat. No, I'm not tempted." I looked down at him, at the sincere confusion in his eyes. "What about you? Don't you think a girl should leap at a chance like that?" He shrugged, a slow, easy movement. "I think a girl should leap at what makes her happy. So what does make you happy, Elara Vance? What kind of man would tempt you?" The question hung in the frosty air. From my vantage point, my eyes inadvertently dipped to the open collar of his hastily donned shirt, where the memory of his powerful shoulders and the sheen of effort still danced in my mind's eye. A mischievous, reckless impulse took hold. I met his gaze, a slow smile spreading on my lips. "Oh, I don't know. Someone capable. Someone with a strong back. Maybe even," I added, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, Someone who isn't afraid of a little hard work in the cold. I saw the exact moment the implication hit him. He didn't get angry. He just froze, his eyes holding mine, the red returning to his cheeks. Really? He asked, the word barely a breath. Really? I affirmed, my own face heating. A grin broke across his face then, so wide and unguarded it lit up his whole countenance. It was the grin from my memory, the one he'd given me by the fence in another life. But now it was directed at me in this one, full of a dawning, hopeful joy. I leaned forward, unable to resist, adding, "And you know it wouldn't hurt if he was good with an axe." Leo's grin turned goofy, utterly charming in its lack of artifice. He ducked his head, chuckling, and when he looked up his eyes were bright. "Noted," he said, his voice warm. I was basking in that warmth, in the simple, thrilling novelty of a positive connection, when the sound I'd been dreading shattered the moment. "Alara Vance, get down from that wall this instant." My mother's voice was a lash of fury. I flinched, my idol crumbling. I turned to see her standing at our door, basket on her arm. She'd actually gone to the market, her face a mask of betrayal and rage. Leo instantly straightened up, his smile vanishing, replaced by a look of wary politeness. My homecoming was not a gentle one. My mother dragged me inside by my elbow, her grip like iron. The moment the door shut, she rounded on me. "He told me. Julian told me you were vile to him. That you drove him out. Have you lost your mind? That boy was our future. Your future." "My future, mother." I shot back, finding a courage I didn't know I possessed. "And I don't want it. I don't want him." "What you want is irrelevant," she screamed, her face mottled. "Do you think princes are lining up at our gate? He was smart, handsome, from a good family. And you've been making eyes at that orphan next door. A laborer with no family and no prospects. Have you no pride? He has more honor in his little finger than Julian Thorne has in his whole body." I shouted back. The argument raged, circular and brutal. She invoked my duty, my age, the shame I'd bring. I stood my ground, a rock in the torrent of her disappointment. Finally, breathless and tearful, she delivered her ultimatum. "You will stay away from Leo Hart. Do you hear me? Not a word, not a look. If I see you so much as glance over that wall, I'll send you to your aunt in the city." I didn't agree. I just fell silent, a strategic retreat. Arguing further was useless. But as I looked at her, this woman who loved me in her own desperate, limited way, a way that had led her to her death in another timeline, a new, clear resolution crystallized in my mind. Her fears were rooted in a world where a woman's security came only from a man's status. I needed a security she couldn't argue with. I needed my own. I took a deep breath, letting the anger drain from my voice. "Fine, mother. I'll stay away from Leo." I paused, letting the concession hang. "But there's something else I want. Something that has nothing to do with any man." She eyed me suspiciously, wiping her eyes. "What?" "I want to go back to school. I want to take the high school equivalency exams. I want to go to university." The silence that followed was absolute, more profound than any of her shouting. She stared at me as if I'd just spoken in tongues. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Then her expression hardened into something colder than anger. Dismissive practicality. "Don't be absurd, girl. The money in this house is for your brother's education. We can't waste it on fancy ideas. A girl's place is to make a good match." "I know," I finished, bitterness creeping back. "But what if the match I make is with my own mind? What if I could earn my own golden ticket?" "No," she said, flat and final. "It's a foolish dream. You'll stay here, you'll behave, and when a suitable boy comes along you'll marry him. End of discussion." The wall she was building wasn't just between me and Leo. It was around my entire life, brick by suffocating brick. I knew then that persuasion was futile. I'd need another path. But as I turned to go to my room, defeated in this skirmish, I wasn't despairing. I was planning. And from the other side of the very wall we'd been arguing about, I was sure Leo Hart had heard every word. The thought didn't embarrass me. It fueled me. The first seeds of rebellion had been sown, against a doomed fate, against societal expectation, and against the limits of my own former self. The path ahead was uncharted, but for the first time in either of my lives I was holding the compass. The stalemate in our house had the brittle quality of thin ice. For 2 days I moved through my chores like a ghost, speaking only when necessary. My mother watched me with the sharp, suspicious eyes of a jailer, convinced my silence was a prelude to some act of rebellion involving the man next door. She'd taken to checking the perimeter, which involved glaring out the window toward Leo's cottage at regular intervals. I spent those days not pining but plotting. In my past life, I'd devoured textbooks in stolen moments, trying to bridge the intellectual gap I felt with Julian. That self-directed study was a hidden reservoir I could now draw from. The high school equivalency exam was a mountain, but not an unclimbable one. The real obstacle was the foothills of tuition and fees. On the third morning, as I scrubbed pots at the sink, the sound of raised voices from the yard next door filtered through the wall. My mother's, high and flustered, and a lower, calmer rumble that was unmistakably Leo's. My heart slammed against my ribs. I dropped the pot with a clatter and raced to the front window, wiping my hands on my apron. Leo was standing in our yard, dressed in clean if well-worn trousers and a sturdy wool jacket. He looked unbearably formal and uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. My mother stood before him, arms crossed, a formidable barrier of maternal disapproval. I couldn't hear the initial exchange, but I saw Leo reach into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy-looking cloth pouch, the kind men used for tobacco or spare screws. But he didn't offer tobacco. He held it out to my mother, his posture stiff with resolve. My mother recoiled as if he'd offered her a snake. Her mouth moved in a rapid negative shake. Leo persisted, saying something, his free hand gesturing toward the house, toward me. I saw the words form on his lips. For her school. That was all it took. My mother's face, initially flushed with awkwardness, drained of color, then flooded with a furious, protective red. She understood instantly. This wasn't neighborly kindness. This was a claim. A statement of intent. Her worst suspicion was manifesting in our own yard, offering cash. She snatched the pouch, not to accept it but to thrust it back against his chest. Absolutely not. Her voice finally carried through the glass. We take care of our own, Leo Hart. You keep your money for your own future wife. The last words were pointed, barbed. But Leo, usually so reticent, stood his ground. He didn't take the pouch back. He just looked at her, his weathered face earnest. Ma'am, I saved it. It's meant for her. That did it. My mother's last thread of civility snapped. Get out, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. Get off my property and don't you dare come back with your charity. She placed both hands on his shoulders and physically pushed him, a shocking breach of village decorum. Leo, too stunned to resist, stumbled back a few steps. Before he could say another word, my mother had spun on her heel, marched inside, and slammed the front door so hard the windowpane I was hiding behind rattled. She leaned against the closed door, breathing heavily, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and fear. When she saw me standing there, her fear won out. She pointed a trembling finger at me. You see what you've invited? That boy thinks he can buy his way into this family. He has no shame. No respect for boundaries. He was trying to help. I protested, my own anger rising. He heard me say I wanted to go to school. Help, she shrieked, advancing on me. That's not help, Alara. That's a down payment. Do you want the whole village to say you're beholden to a penniless orphan? That you had to be bought because no decent man would have you? Her eyes welled with tears of sheer frustration. I am trying to protect you. Why can't you see that? The argument that followed was the most vicious yet. It ended with her locking me in my room, a childish measure she hadn't resorted to since I was 12, and summoning my father Thomas, home from his work at the grain cooperative early. I heard their murmured conference through the floorboards, a tense, low rumble that went on for hours. My father was a quiet man, less governed by social anxiety than my mother, but fiercely protective of our family's fragile standing. Finally, the lock clicked open. My father stood there, his face etched with weary resolve. Come downstairs, Alara. In the kitchen, my mother sat at the table, her face pale but set. My father remained standing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Your mother has told me everything, he began, his voice gravelly. About Julian Thorne. About your aspirations. About Leo Hart. I weighted my throat tight. We've talked it over, he said, exchanging a look with my mother. She gave a small, sharp nod. If you are so set on this school idea, We will find a way. A spark of hope ignited in my chest. But my father wasn't finished. We will sell the south pasture. The words cost him something. That land had been in his family for generations. It should cover your first year if you're frugal. The sacrifice was staggering. The hope turned to a heavy, guilty warmth. Dad, you don't have to. I do, he interrupted, his voice firm. If this is your mind, then I'll not have it said I didn't support my daughter. He took a deep breath. But there is a condition. A non-negotiable one. My mother's eyes locked onto mine, blazing with the intensity of this victory. You will have no contact with Leo Hart, my father stated. None. Not a word, not a letter, not a wave across a field. You will focus entirely on your studies. That boy and his money are a distraction you cannot afford. His path and yours, they do not cross. Do you understand? The ultimatum was a cage, but it was a cage with a door that led somewhere I desperately wanted to go. To refuse was to choose Leo over my own future. A romantic but ultimately foolish choice that mirrored my old mistakes. I couldn't build a life for someone or because of someone. I had to build it for myself even if the foundation felt lonely. I looked at my mother's rigid face, my father's solemn one. I thought of Leo's earnest eyes as he offered his savings. I thought of Julian's sneer. And I thought of the cliff edge. I understand, I said, my voice clear and surprisingly steady. I'll focus on my studies. The relief in the room was palpable. My mother sagged in her chair. My father gave a single grim nod. Then it settled. We'll see to the land sale next week. You'll start the preparatory courses in town. Their actions were swift, born of a panic to separate me from Leo's influence. They sold the pasture at a loss for a quick sale. Within 10 days I was standing in the administrative office of the County Continuing Education Center in town, my father beside me signing forms. They paid a premium for a coveted spot in the women's dormitory, a fortified, respectable distance from both home and any potential suitors. By the time I processed what was happening, I was sitting at a wooden desk in a sunlit classroom, a stack of textbooks in front of me, surrounded by a murmur of strangers. The smell of chalk dust and old paper was intoxicating. It was freedom even if it was a gilded, monitored one. For the first week I lost myself in the sheer joy of learning. The equations, the historical dates, the chemical formulas, they were puzzles, not chores. My mind, thirsty from years of neglect and emotional turmoil, soaked it up. I was so focused that I barely noticed my classmates. Until the second Monday. I walked into my history class, scanning for a seat in the back. And there, in the front row, turning to see who had entered, was Julian Thorne. Our eyes met. His face, usually a mask of composed arrogance, underwent a rapid, violent transformation. The color leached from it, leaving a sickly gray. His eyes widened, not with delight but with pure, unadulterated shock, as if he'd seen a specter. His pencil slipped from his fingers and clattered on the floor. He stared at me throughout the entire lecture, a fixed, unnerving gaze that my peripheral vision couldn't ignore. The teacher called his name twice before he jerked back to attention, flustered. The whisper started like a brush fire. Did you see how he looked at the new girl? At the mid-class break he was on me before I could gather my books. He grabbed my elbow, his fingers tight, and steered me into the empty, dimly lit hallway by the janitor's closet. What are you doing here? He demanded, his voice a low, strained hiss. The question was identical to the one he'd asked in my first life, but the tone was different. Then it had been discussed. Now it was a mixture of panic and fury. I wrenched my arm free, stepping back into a patch of light from a high window. I'm studying, Julian. Something you should probably try instead of gawking. His jaw worked. Don't get clever with me. This isn't a place for you. School isn't for girls like you. You should be at home. The old script was trying to reassert itself, but his confidence was cracked. My presence here was an anomaly he couldn't process. A cold smile touched my lips. I didn't lower my voice. For girls like me? You mean girls who work for what they want? Who don't wait for handouts? This school isn't your private club, Julian. I have every right to be here. More perhaps, since I'm not here to preen, I'm here to learn. My words, loud in the echoing hall, drew glances from passing students. Julian's face flushed with humiliation. He leaned in, his breath hot on my face. You're making a fool of yourself. Leave. No. And maybe I'll forget this embarrassment. The threat was pathetic. I laughed, a short, sharp sound. You'll forget? How magnanimous. Let me be clearer than I was at my house. You or nothing to me. My being here has nothing to do with you. Now get out of my way. You're blocking the light. I went to push past him. In his rage and fluster, he stumbled backward, right into the stooped, elderly frame of Principal Davies, who was rounding the corner with an armful of files. The collision was spectacular. The principal yelped. Files exploded into a blizzard of white paper. Julian, flailing, stepped down with a sickening crunch right on the principal's fallen spectacles. The sound of grinding glass seemed to echo forever. The hallway, previously murmuring, fell into a dead, horrified silence. Principal Davies, red-faced and disoriented, was helped to his feet by a passing teacher. He looked from the ruins of his glasses to Julian, who stood frozen like a statue of guilt, to the scattered evidence of his interrupted journey. Half an hour later, the entire student body was assembled in the main yard. Under the pitiless winter sky, Principal Davies, wearing a spare pair of spectacles that magnified his furious eyes, demanded an explanation. Julian stood beside me, head bowed, shoulders hunched, radiating a toxic mix of shame and fury. He said nothing. "Miss Vance," the principal said, his voice cold. "Would you care to explain the altercation in the hallway?" Every eye was on me. I felt the weight of them, the expectation of a girl's tears, of flustered excuses. I took a deep breath of the cold air. I didn't look at Julian. I looked at the principal, my voice clear and carrying across the silent yard. Julian Thorne approached me during the break. I began and calmly, precisely recounted his words. His assertion that school wasn't for girls like me, his demand that I leave, his attempt to physically corner me. I left out nothing, my tone factual, unemotional. When I attempted to return to class, he moved to block me, lost his balance and collided with you, sir. It was an accident born of his attempt to intimidate me, but an accident nonetheless. The silence that followed was deeper, more profound. Then it broke into a wave of hushed, excited whispers. Julian's head snapped up. The look he gave me wasn't just angry, it was shattered. The golden boy, the county's top scorer, had been publicly unmasked as a petty bully. The carefully constructed edifice of his superiority crumbled in that moment, brick by mortified brick. The official punishment was a severe reprimand and probation. The real punishment was social. The whispers followed him everywhere. "Did you hear what he said to that Vance girl? So arrogant. Thinks he owns the school." The isolation he'd once made me feel now closed around him. He became a ghost in the hallways, flinching at laughter, his grades beginning a slow, steady slide. I had won. I had defended my place and humiliated my tormentor. But as I walked back to the dormitory that afternoon, the victory felt hollow and precarious. I had seen the look in Julian's eyes in the yard. It wasn't just humiliation. It was the look of a cornered animal. And cornered animals are the most dangerous kind. My war wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more volatile phase. And through it all, the memory of Leo's rejected pouch and my father's grim condition were a lonely counterpoint. I was building my future, but I was building it alone behind a wall that was now both figurative and, thanks to my mother, likely several bricks taller. The fallout from the hallway incident was a stain that wouldn't wash out. Julian Thorne, once the untouchable prince of county continuing education, became a pariah in slow motion. The whispers were a constant, corrosive hum. He stopped raising his hand in class. He ate lunch alone, a solitary figure at the end of a long table, pushing food around his plate. The confident set of his shoulders crumpled into a perpetual hunch. I tried to ignore him, to bury myself in integrals and sonnets. But his presence was a dark gravity well, warping the space around me. I'd feel his gaze on the back of my neck during lectures, a cold, persistent pressure. When I'd turn, his eyes would dart away, but not before I caught the glint in them. Not anger anymore, but a kind of feverish, obsessive calculation. My desk mate, a sharp-eyed girl named Mina, nudged me one afternoon as we packed up after chemistry. "Ilara," she murmured, leaning close. "Be careful walking back to the dorms. I saw Julian watching you from the library window yesterday. The way he looks, it's not right." I patted the side of my canvas satchel, where a smooth, heavy river stone I'd picked up from the ground sat nestled beside my books. "I'm careful," I assured her. but a prickle of unease traced my spine. The last day of term before winter break dawned gray and heavy with the promise of snow. The air in the school crackled with a different kind of energy, the frantic joy of impending release. Students spilled out of classrooms, laughing, shouting plans, hauling bags of laundry and books home. I took a different route back to the dormitory, avoiding the usual main road crowded with buses. I chose a shortcut through the warren of narrow, cobbled service lanes behind the school buildings, a path usually deserted. The high, ivy-covered walls muffled the distant sounds of celebration, casting the lane in deep, premature twilight. My footsteps echoed too loudly. I tightened my grip on the strap of my satchel, my other hand slipping inside to find the cool, reassuring weight of the stone. I was halfway through the longest lane when I heard it. A second set of footsteps deliberately matching my pace, then slowing when I slowed. I didn't need to turn around. I knew. Ilara. His voice was a rasp close behind me. I kept walking, my heart hammering against my ribs. Ilara, stop. A hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. Julian stood there, his face pale and gaunt in the gloom. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, swimming with a terrifying, unfocused intensity. His school bag lay discarded at his feet. He let out a low, breathy sound that was almost a laugh. "It's all your fault," he whispered, the words slithering out. "You did this. You ruined everything." I shook off his hand, taking a step back. "You did that to yourself, Julian. No one made you say those things. No one made you shove the principal. You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice rising. "You're a factory girl. A nobody. You belong in the dirt, not in my school." The veneer of the educated man was gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, entitled cruelty beneath. "You need to be put in your place." He lunged. Not for my bag, not to hit me, but to grab me, to pin me against the cold stone wall. I yanked my hand from my satchel, the river stone clenched in my fist. I was ready to bring it down. But the blow never came. A shadow detached itself from an alcove farther down the lane. A booted foot shot out, connecting with the back of Julian's knee with a sickening crack. Julian screamed, a high animal sound, and pitched forward. His face met the cobblestones with a wet, crunching thud. He lay there moaning. Leo Hart stepped into the sliver of light between the walls. His face was not the open, smiling one from over the garden wall. It was carved from granite, his eyes flat and dangerous. He didn't look at me. His entire focus was on the writhing boy at his feet. He moved forward, grabbed a fistful of Julian's hair, and yanked his head back, exposing his throat. "Go on," Leo growled, his voice so low and cold it raced the hair on my arms. "Say another word to her." Julian's eyes rolled, unfocused with pain. He spat a pink froth. Something small and white clattered onto the cobbles. A front tooth. I let out a slow breath, my grip on the stone relaxing. Seemed I wouldn't need it after all. For a moment, there was only the sound of Julian's ragged breathing. Then something shifted in his pain-glazed eyes. He was staring up at Leo, and his expression morphed from agony to a dawning, bone-deep terror. His whole body began to tremble violently. Leo frowned, his own anger momentarily displaced by confusion. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice still hard. Julian's reaction was instantaneous, irrational panic. No, I don't. I don't know you," he babbled, scrambling backward like a crab, his hands slipping in the grime of the lane. "I won't go near her again, I swear. I swear." His voice climbed into a hysterical shriek. And then, to my utter disbelief, a dark stain spread across the front of his trousers. The sharp, acrid smell of urine cut through the damp air. Leo recoiled in disgust, releasing him. Julian curled into a fetal position, sobbing, clutching his mouth. Without a word, Leo turned to me. The ice in his eyes melted, replaced by a fierce concern. He took my hand, his own calloused and warm, and gently pried the river stone from my frozen fingers, dropping it into my satchel. "Let's go," he said quietly, and led me out of the alley, leaving Julian weeping in the filth. We walked in silence for a block before my adrenaline-shocked brain formulated a question. "How did you know where to find me?" He slung my satchel over his own broad shoulder, the casual intimacy of the gesture making my heart ache. "There are only two places in this town you could be," he said, a hint of his old grin touching his lips. "The school or the dormitory. This lane is between them." Seemed like a place someone might get cornered. The grin faded. I've been keeping an eye out. Your parents might have raised the wall, but they can't stop me from walking public streets. The wall? I asked, my mind still partly back in the alley with Julian's terrified face. He sighed, a sound of pure, weary frustration. Aunt Clara and Uncle Thomas. They added a good 1.5 feet of stone and mortar to the top of the boundary wall. Last week. He glanced at me, a wry look in his eyes. At first I thought they were just doing repairs. I even offered to mix the mortar. I stared at him, a hysterical bubble of laughter threatening to burst in my chest. You didn't. I did. Handed them bricks and everything. Took me 3 days to realize they weren't building a wall. They were building a fortress. And then, he added, his tone turning solemn, they lined the base of it. With traps. Traps. The word was absurd. He nodded grimly. Mouse traps. The big spring-loaded kind. Must be 24 of them all around our side. Baited with cheese. He looked so genuinely, comically aggrieved that the laughter finally escaped. A shaky, relieved sound. The image of my stern, respectable parents engaged in clandestine trap-setting was too much. The bus ride back to our village was quiet. We sat side by side, the shared violence of the alley creating a silent, profound bond between us. As the familiar fields rolled by, he handed me back my satchel. You should walk the rest of the way alone, he said softly as the bus shuddered to a halt at our stop. Better if your dad doesn't see us together. I nodded, the weight of my parents' decree settling back over me. But as I took the bag, I felt an unfamiliar bulk. I unclasped it and looked inside. Nestled beside my textbooks was a small, familiar cloth pouch. I pulled it out, the leather warm from being carried so close to his body. Leo, I said, holding it out. Take it back. I can't. His face flushed. He shoved his hands in his pockets. That's not mine. I raised an eyebrow. Really? So if I throw this unknown pouch into the ditch, you won't mind? He grimaced, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Why won't you let me help? He asked, his voice raw. If I don't give it to you, who else would I give it to? I saved it. For you. His sincerity was a physical force, an echo of my own foolish devotion in another life. But that was the lesson, wasn't it? Love shouldn't be a transaction of sacrifice. Keep it, I said gently, pressing the pouch into his hand. He tried to pull away, but I held firm. If things are ever different, you can give it to me then. As a promise, not a lifeline. He was smart. He understood the subtext. If your parents ever relent, if I become my own person, if we stand on equal ground. He looked at me for a long moment, the conflict clear in his eyes. Even if that day never comes, he said quietly, I'd still want you to have it. Giving it to you. It makes me feel like I'm part of your future, even from the other side of a wall. His words were a knife to my heart, beautiful and painful. I know, I whispered. But I'd rather you use this for yourself. Didn't you always talk about opening a proper workshop? Use it for that. Build something for your future. Then if you still want to, you can share it with me later. He didn't agree, but he stopped resisting, his fingers closing reluctantly around the pouch. Just then I saw my father's tall figure appear at the far end of the lane, heading home from the mill. Panic flashed through me. Go, I urged, giving Leo a little push. He hesitated, then with one last lingering look he turned and melted down a side path. I walked the remaining distance alone, the encounter with Julian feeling like a dark dream. But when I reached our property, Leo's understatement became vividly clear. The wall between our homes now stood a formidable 7 feet tall, crowned with jagged bits of mortar-dipped glass. And along its base, nearly invisible in the long winter grass, was a sinister line of small, sprung-jawed metal traps. My father, the quiet mill worker, had declared a silent, bizarre war. My mother was waiting in the doorway. See, she said, her voice tight with vindication. We're protecting you. From yourself, if necessary. The entire winter break was an exercise in soft captivity. I was allowed to study, to cook, to mend, but any movement toward the front of the house or the windows facing Leo's cottage was met with a pointed question or a redirected task. The fortress was complete and I was its willing-unwilling princess. It wasn't until the day before term started, as I boarded the bus back to town, that I saw him again. He was already there, sitting in the very back. Our eyes met across the crowded aisle and he gave me a slow, quiet smile that seemed to say, "I'm still here." He was carrying a large canvas duffel. When I slid into the empty seat beside him, he didn't speak. Instead, he opened the bag. First, he pulled out a soft dove-gray wool scarf and carefully wrapped it around my neck. Then came a pair of knitted gloves, still bearing the faint, clean scent of lanolin. Finally, he produced an old glass bottle, the kind once used for medicine, now filled with steaming hot water and stoppered with a cork. He slipped it into my gloved hands. The warmth seeped into my bones. For the entire hour-long journey, he fussed over me with a wordless, tender intensity. He produced a bag of sunflower seeds and painstakingly cracked each one open, depositing the tiny salty kernels into my palm. His focus was absolute, his demeanor one of quiet, boundless caretaking. He had a steadiness, a rooted maturity that boys like Julian could only mimic with arrogance. I found myself watching him, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled against his collar, the quiet competence in his hands. He was, I realized with a jolt, more handsome than Julian had ever been. His beauty wasn't polished. It was earned, etched by sun and labor into something solid and real. He caught me looking. A slow, deep blush spread from his neck to his hairline. He looked flustered, then reached out and gently covered my eyes with his cool, work-roughened palm. "Stop," he murmured, though he was smiling. I didn't pull away. Instead, I reached up, took his hand from my eyes and held it between both of my own, sandwiching it over the warm glass bottle. He went utterly still, a statue of surprise and hope. Then slowly his smile returned, brighter than the weak winter sun streaming through the bus window. When we reached the stop near the school, he walked me to the gate, then turned to head back to the bus station, his own path leading elsewhere. To suppliers, to job sites, to the practical world he inhabited. I stood watching his retreating back, a confusing mix of affection, guilt, and longing swelling in my chest. I had a future to seize, and he was respecting that even as he silently defied the walls meant to keep him out. I turned toward the school gates, my resolve hardened, and found Julian Thorne blocking my path. He stood there, leaning against the brick pillar. All trace of the broken, sobbing boy from the alley was gone. In its place was a cold, eerie calm. His eyes were clear, sharp, and locked on me with a terrifying certainty. "So," he said, his voice unervingly flat. "It's true. You came with him." He took a step closer. The smell of winter air and cheap soap clung to him. "Tell me, Alara, have you been sneaking around with that laborer all this time? Is that why you were so high and mighty with me?" I met his gaze, letting my disgust show. "What I do is none of your business, Julian. Are you still not done making a fool of yourself?" His chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. But this time he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he studied my face, his head tilted as if deciphering a code. His lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. "You're one of us too, aren't you?" he said, the words dropping into the space between us like stones into a still pond. "You came back." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The bus noise, the distant shouts of students, everything receded into a dull roar. He knew. The thought had been a fleeting, nightmarish possibility, but hearing it confirmed was a different kind of shock. I forced my face to remain still. "What did you say?" His smile widened, triumphant. "You heard me. I didn't expect it. I didn't die that day, you know. The car went over, but I was thrown clear. 10 meters down, smashed up but alive." He gave a short, bitter bark of laughter. "Guess the devil looks after his own. I lived. I married that graduate student. Made a miserable life of it. She never let me forget I was lesser." He was talking about the life after the one I remembered. The life where I had died and he had lived on. My mind reeled. "And Leo?" I heard myself ask, the old name slipping out before I could stop it. "Leo, you mean?" Julian's eyes glinted with malicious pleasure. "Oh, he found me. Years later. After she'd finished humiliating me. He tracked me down. Threw me off a cliff. The same one, I think. Poetic, don't you think?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Then he killed himself. See, only I came back. Only I remember everything. The next 15 years, Alara. I know what's coming. I can make us rich. Powerful. All you have to do is be with me. Like you were supposed to be." He was offering me a nightmare wrapped in a promise. He had survived our mutual destruction, endured a bitter life, and now, armed with hindsight, he saw me not as a person, but as a compliant tool he'd once misplaced. His love was the nostalgia of a tyrant for his most useful slave. I looked at him, this pitiful, dangerous ghost from two pasts, and I felt a profound, clarifying pity. "Do you know why she hated you? That wife of yours?" I asked, my voice quiet. He blinked, thrown off script. "Because she was a shrew." Because you were never worthy of love, Julian." I cut him off, the truth cold and clean as the winter air. "You take and you break and you blame. You were betrayed because you are, at your core, a betrayer. A man like you could come back 100 times and no one would ever love you." "Not truly." His calm shattered. His face contorted, the mask of control crumbling into raw, childlike panic. "That's a lie. You loved me." "You did. You have to." His voice cracked. "You love me, Alara. You have to." The shout was a plea and a command, desperate and unhinged. He lunged, hands outstretched to grab me, to shake the truth he wanted into me. But a figure was already moving, a blur of motion from the direction of the bus stop. Leo had come back. His fist connected with Julian's jaw with a sound like a branch snapping. Julian staggered but didn't fall. He shook his head, dazed, and then his wild eyes found me again. He lurched forward, a man possessed. "She's mine. No one takes her from me. She's the only one. The only one who ever really loved me." Leo shoved me behind him, a wall of solid muscle. He caught Julian by the throat, holding him at arm's length as he thrashed. Julian, pinned, gasped for air. Then a horrible, twisted grin split his bloody lips. He looked past Leo, his eyes finding mine. "Did you know?" he croaked, his voice gurgling. "In our last life, I had my fill of her. Every part of her. And you," he spat the word toward Leo, "you were the fool who still wanted the scraps. The woman you love most, she's just something I used and threw away." Nausea, hot and violent, rose in my throat. Instinctively, I tried to pull my hand from Leo's, a wave of shame so profound it threatened to drown me. But Leo's grip only tightened, an unbreakable anchor. He didn't say a word. He just took a step back and with a cold, terrifying efficiency, drove his boot into Julian's stomach. The air left Julian's lungs in a sickening whoosh. He folded in half, flew backward several feet, and landed in a heap on the frozen ground. He didn't move. The world rushed back in, sounds cold, the stark reality of the violent scene. Leo stood over him, chest heaving, his face a mask of protective fury. Julian Thorne, the ghost who had haunted 2 of my lives, lay broken and still in the dirt. And Leo Hart, the man from the other side of the wall, had just walked through fire to stand by my side. For a long moment, there was only the sound of our ragged breathing pluming in the cold air. Leo stood like a sentinel over Julian's motionless form, his shoulders tense, his fists still clenched. I stared, half expecting Julian to rise again, a revenant that refused to stay dead. But he didn't stir. A distant shout from the school gates broke the spell. Leo's head snapped up. He looked at me, then back at Julian, his expression shifting from fury to grim practicality. "We need to go. Now." He didn't wait for my agreement. He simply took my hand again, his grip firm and sure, and pulled me away from the scene, around the corner of a building, into the maze of side streets. We walked fast, not running, but with a purposeful stride that put distance between us and the possible consequences. He didn't speak until we were several blocks away, in a quiet, snow-dusted park overlooking the town. He stopped, finally releasing my hand. He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine, filled with a turmoil I'd never seen in him before. Anger, concern, and a desperate, confused hurt. "Alara," he said, his voice rough. What in God's name was he talking about? The question I'd been dreading. The dam of secrets I'd built between us was cracking. I wrapped my arms around myself, the warmth from the bus bottle long gone. "He's insane, Leo. You saw him. He's completely lost his mind." "He knew my name," Leo said quietly, cutting through my evasion. "And he looked at me in that alley like he'd seen a ghost. Like I was the monster from his nightmares. That wasn't just insanity. That was recognition." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "And he said, 'Our last life.' He talked about a cliff. About me." He couldn't finish the sentence about throwing Julian off a cliff. His jaw tightened. "What is he to you, Alara? Really?" There was no going back. The lies and half-truths were a wall as imprisoning as the one my parents had built. I had asked him for honesty. I owed him nothing less. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air burning my lungs. "Let's sit," I said, gesturing to a bench under a bare-limbed oak. We sat side by side, not touching. I stared at my gloved hands, gathering the scattered, painful pieces of my history. "He wasn't lying about coming back," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "And neither was I." I told him. I started from the beginning. Not this beginning but the first one. The naive girl who fell for Julian Thorne's promises. The years of sacrifice, sending money, cooking and cleaning for him during breaks, living in hope. I described the day of his graduation, finding him with another woman, the cruel, dismissive words that shattered my world. I recounted my mother's futile rage, her death at his family's gate, the suffocating shame that followed. Leo listened in utter silence, his body rigid beside me. When I reached the part about my forced marriage to Julian, the joyless ceremony, his hand twitched on his knee. "On the wedding day," I continued, my voice growing colder, flatter as I detached myself from the memory, "when the car passed the ravine near my mother's grave, I told the driver to stop. I got behind the wheel. And I drove us both over the edge of Raven's Crag." A sharp, involuntary intake of breath from Leo. I didn't look at him. "I died. I know I did. I felt the impact. And then I woke up. Here. 18 again, with Mrs. Beecham knocking on the door. That's why I refused him. That's why I knew." The silence stretched, filled with the rustle of dead leaves and the distant hum of the town. I finally dared a glance at him. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on some distant point, processing a reality that defied all reason. "And him?" Leo asked finally, his voice hoarse. "He said he lived." I nodded. "He must have. He remembers a life after that, after I died. A life where he married that other woman and was miserable. And where you," I swallowed, "where you found him. And killed him. For me." Leo flinched as if struck. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes dark with a horror that wasn't fear but empathy. "I did that," he breathed. "According to him. He said you threw him off a cliff. The same one. And then you killed yourself." The last words were almost inaudible. Leo absorbed this, his brow furrowed. He didn't deny it. He simply asked, "Why? Why would I do that?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I wasn't there. But in that life, after my mother died, after everyone turned away, you were the only one who didn't. The day before that awful wedding, you climbed onto the wall between our houses. You said, 'Why not me, Alara? I'm not as educated, but I've got two good hands and I don't break my promises.'" I repeated his words from a lifetime ago, my throat tight. "I told you, not in this life. But if there's another one, I'll find you. You just grinned and said you might be the one to turn me down next time." A strange choke sound escaped Leo. It was almost a laugh, but it was filled with unbearable sadness. He looked down at his own hands, those strong, capable, promise-keeping hands. "So I kept my promise," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Even when you were gone." The raw grief in his voice, for a version of me he'd never even known, for a heroic, tragic version of himself, shattered my last defenses. A tear spilled over and traced a cold path down my cheek. "He came back with all those memories," Leo said, his focus returning, sharpening. "And he thought, what? That you'd just fall in line again? That his future knowledge was a prize you'd want. He thinks he's the hero of the story," I said bitterly, wiping my cheek. "The one who suffered and learned. He thinks his love, his possession, is a gift. He can't comprehend that he's the villain in every version." Leo was silent for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been haunting the edges of my story. "How old were you?" His voice was dangerously calm. "When you died the first time." The air left my lungs. 28. His reaction was instantaneous and visceral. His whole body coiled, a spring of suppressed violence. He stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps away from the bench, his back to me. His shoulders were rigid. When he spoke again, his voice was a low, trembling rasp forced through clenched teeth. 10 years, he said. He had 10 years with you. After the cliff." He turned, and the look on his face was one of pure, agonized fury. "What did he do to you? In those years?" He wasn't asking for the timeline. He was asking for the texture of the misery. The daily humiliations, the slow erosion of a soul. I couldn't give him the details. The locked doors, the controlled money, the casual insults, the way he'd flaunt his intelligence to belittle me, the isolation from anyone who showed me kindness. It was a slow, suffocating death by 1,000 cuts. He controlled everything, I said simply, my voice hollow. I was a prisoner. A trophy he'd won and then despised. He reminded me every day that I was lucky he'd married me at all. Leo stared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The anger in his eyes was so profound it seemed to burn away the last of his confusion, leaving behind a crystal-clear, terrifying purpose. And me? He demanded, the words raw. Where was I? In that life? Did I just stand by and watch? This, at least, I could give him as a comfort. A small, dark consolation. I managed a faint, sad smile. You asked how he came back to life. After the car crash. Understanding dawned on his face, followed by a staggering wave of relief that momentarily eclipsed his rage. His tense posture slackened a fraction. So, it was me. It wasn't a question. I nodded. You were the end of his story. The reckoning. He walked back to the bench and sank down beside me, the fight gone out of him for a moment, replaced by a weary, profound sorrow. He looked toward the town, toward the school where Julian likely still lay. He saw me today, Leo said softly, and he didn't see a rival. He saw his executioner. That's why he was so afraid. We sat in silence for a long time, the shared weight of two terrible pasts settling between us. The winter sun dipped lower, casting long, skeletal shadows. We should report what happened, I said finally, the practical world intruding. He attacked me. You defended me. Leo shook his head slowly. He won't say anything. Not after what he screamed. And if we report it, it all comes out. The shouting, the bizarre claims. Your parents, the wall, the traps. They'll say it was a lover's quarrel gone wrong. It'll be your word against his, and he's the university student. He looked at me, his expression grave. The cleanest break is to let this be his end. Let the school, the town deal with him as he is now. A boy who finally snapped. He was right. Engaging further would only pull me back into Julian's toxic orbit. What will happen to him? I asked. I don't know, Leo said. But he won't bother you again. Not after today. There was a finality in his tone that brooked no argument. A week later, the rumors reached the dormitory, passed in hushed tones between classes. Julian Thorne had been found wandering near the school gates, disoriented and incoherent, missing a tooth. He'd been taken to the county hospital. His mother, the proud, sharp-faced woman I remembered, had arrived in a state of hysterical disgrace. The official word was a nervous breakdown, exacerbated by academic pressure. The unofficial word was that he'd gone mad. He was withdrawn from the continuing education center. The golden boy was now a cautionary tale. Leo took me to see him once, a month later. He said I needed to see the end of the ghost, to lay it to rest. The county psychiatric ward was a long, low, white building that smelled of antiseptic and boiled cabbage. We got special permission as distant, concerned acquaintances. Julian was in a common room, dressed in a faded, institutional blue smock. He was on his hands and knees on the linoleum floor, intently following the progress of a line of ants marching toward a crumb-strewn windowsill. He was murmuring to them, his voice a childish sing-song. His face was blank, smooth of all its former arrogance and malice. He was utterly, profoundly gone. We watched from a bench in the corridor. I felt nothing. No triumph, no pity. Just a vast, empty silence where a great dread had once lived. After a long while, Leo stood up. His face was unreadable. He walked to the doorway of the common room, glanced around to ensure the orderly was distracted, and then with a swift, deliberate motion he kicked over the small dish of sugar water that was attracting the ants. The porcelain clattered. The ants scattered in chaos. Julian let out a cry of pure, devastated loss, scrambling after his ruined world on his knees. We didn't look back. He returned to me, took my hand and led me out of the building into the clean, cold light of afternoon. We didn't speak until we were on the bus back home. He's gone, Leo said simply. The person who hurt you doesn't exist anymore. It was true. The Julian I had feared, the one from 2 lifetimes, was erased. What remained was a hollow shell. The battle was over. The victory, however, felt solitary. My parents, though they'd heard the shocking gossip about Julian's collapse, remained steadfast in their primary mission, keeping Leo Hart away from their daughter. The wall stood. The unspoken rule held. But something had fundamentally shifted between Leo and me. The truths had been aired, the monsters named. We had a shared, impossible history that existed in whispers and echoes. We didn't speak of it again, but it lived in the new depth of his looks, in the protective way he'd subtly position himself between me and any perceived threat, in the quiet understanding that passed between us without words. He began meeting my bus every Friday when I came home for the weekend. He'd be there, leaning against the lamppost, a small paper-wrapped bundle in his hand, a fresh pastry from the town bakery, a new pen he thought I'd like, a spool of ribbon the color of my scarf. He'd walk me to the bend in the lane where our house became visible, hand me the bundle, and then melt away into the trees before my father's watchful eyes could spot him. It was a clandestine, tender dance. We were two people building a friendship, a trust, across a no-man's land fortified by fear and tradition. He asked about my classes. I asked about his work. He was saving more diligently than ever, he said. Had his eye on a small vacant storefront near the town square. For that workshop, he'd say with a meaningful look. I buried myself in my studies with a furious intensity. Julian's ghost was gone, but his legacy, the terrifying vulnerability of being a woman with no means of her own, was my greatest motivator. I would not be at the mercy of any man's whims, good or bad. My mind was my currency, my degree, my shield. The months blurred into seasons. The snow melted, revealing muddy fields which then greened and burst into summer wildflowers. My first year ended with top marks. My father, now promoted to foreman at the mill, managed to pay for a second year without selling more land. The financial pressure eased, but the emotional siege continued. One Friday in late autumn, as Leo walked me back along the familiar lane, the fallen leaves crunching underfoot, he stopped at our usual parting spot. But instead of handing me a small gift, he took both my hands in his. His were warm, rough with new calluses from a big furniture commission. "Elara," he said, his voice serious. "The vacant storefront. I put a deposit down yesterday." My heart leapt. "Leo, that's wonderful." He nodded, but his eyes held a nervousness I'd never seen before. "It is. It's a start. But it's in town. A good 30-minute bus ride from here." He paused, his thumbs tracing circles on my knuckles. "When you finish your studies, where will you go?" The question hung in the crisp air. It was the question we'd been avoiding. My path was leading me to university, likely in the city. His was rooting him here in the town he was building a business in. The geographical chasm was about to widen. I don't know yet," I said honestly, the old fear of losing him, of our paths diverging forever, gripping me. "The entrance exams are in the spring. I'll apply to places." He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "Wherever you go," he said, his voice low and fervent, "my workshop will have a room above it. With a window that gets the morning sun. It'll be there. Whenever you're ready. If you're ever ready." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a proposal. It was an offering. A door held open indefinitely on the other side of all the walls. A promise of a space that was mine in a future he was building should I ever choose to claim it. Tears pricked my eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelmed, grateful joy. He was giving me the one thing I needed most. A choice made in freedom, not desperation. I squeezed his hands, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. I just nodded. He leaned forward and, with a tenderness that made my breath catch, pressed his lips gently to my forehead. It was our first kiss, chaste, reverent, and filled with a world of waiting hope. "Go on," he whispered, releasing me. "Before your dad sends out a search party." I walked the last 100 yards to my house, the ghost of his kiss burning on my skin, the image of a sunlit room above a workshop shining in my mind like a beacon. The fortress walls still stood. But for the first time I felt I held the key not just to my own future but possibly one day to a gate that led straight to him. The end.